You're listening to Podcasts with Park Rangers, a show where we bring to you stories of the national parks and historic sites from those who know them best, park rangers. Get to know each park ranger for their love of the parks as we discuss history, science, and the beauty of nature from a unique perspective. I'm your host, Lucas VK. Today we interview Cynthia Languth, an interpretive park ranger at Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado.
This park is home for me. It's a landscape that just feels like home. I try to escape for a couple backpacking trips every summer, kind of recenter myself, reinvigorate myself. But even just, looking out on this landscape can give me a little jolt of that when I need it, which is great.
Stay tuned. We'll talk about elk, the Alpine Tundra, and what it takes to dig the highest elevation visitor center in the United States out from over 10 feet of snow every year. If you've been enjoying our podcast, we hope to keep this show on the road with your support. As little as $2 a month gets you access to bonus interview questions. Other levels get bonus episodes, invites to hike with us, and more. If you're interested in joining our exclusive community, check out our Patreon page via the show notes or visit podcastswithparkrangers.com for more info. In the mountains of Colorado, the elk rule Rocky Mountain National Park. Between the park and the Estes Valley, there are over 2,000 elk, many of which stay in the area all winter long. However, it wasn't always the case that the elk were king. In the late 1890s, they were hunted intensively, and few remained in the area. A short time later, before the area was designated a national park, 49 elk were moved from Yellowstone to Rocky to re-establish the population. Today, the descendants of that elk herd can be seen all over the park, and for many visitors, the most exciting time of year is the elk rut. The male elk, also known as bulls, bugle and proudly display their antlers to attract the female elk, known as cows. 1,100-pound bulls round up their harem in the meadows of the park and occasionally spar with a competitor. Listen as two bulls compete for dominance. In these matches, it's not uncommon for a bull to break his antlers or be left with half a rack of horns. The destruction isn't permanent, though, as all bulls lose their antlers every year to regrow in the spring. In May of the following year, the baby elk are born. The cows birth 1 to 2 babies a year and are very protective of these additions to the herd. The bulls and male yearlings born the previous year start to regrow their horns at a rapid rate, at nearly an inch of antler a day. A protective layer of velvet skin develops on the horns, and bulls are found scraping off the layer on trees to prepare for the rut once again in the fall. In the summers, elk can be seen in the alpine areas of the park, feasting on the flourishing vegetation. To learn more about them and the Alpine Tundra itself, we sit down with Ranger Cynthia Languth.
So my name is Cynthia Languth. I'm an interpretive park ranger here at Rocky Mountain National Park. And welcome to Rocky Mountain National Park.
Ranger Cynthia has been with the National Park Service for nearly 20 years. As a child, she was captured by landscapes of the West on national park road trips with her family.
We always took big family road trips in the summer, and we traveled on the cheap, so we would visit national parks. We would, stay in cheap hotels along the way, and eat picnics at the, picnic areas in the parks. And I think from an early age, it was more the aesthetics of the parks that really kind of captured me in my imagination. Just the landscapes of the West, having grown up in the Midwest, the mountains and the desert and the wide open spaces really kind of became, I think, woven into my being as a child.
From a young age, Ranger Cynthia knew she wanted to be a park ranger.
So by the time I was like a preteen, I decided, I wanted to be a park ranger. And I really honestly didn't know what park rangers did because we weren't the family that interacted with park rangers a lot. We stopped at visitor centers, did our own thing, kind of did the driving tour of parks, but we didn't go on ranger hikes. We didn't really interact a whole lot. We didn't camp. So I think I just knew they worked and lived in national parks. So that was good enough at that point, and didn't really change, my direction of what I wanted to do. And I, from an early age, also knew that I wanted to live in the West. So I was, fortunate to be able to kind of just continue down that path into college and after.
Cynthia started as an intern at Rocky and continued as a seasonal ranger in the park system.
My internship was my first introduction to the National Park Service. After my internship, I worked seasonally for several years. So I did work at Rocky Mountain National Park, but I also worked a season at Grand Teton, a season at Olympic National Park, a couple seasons actually in Death Valley National Park in the winter. And then once I was able to get a permanent year-round job, I worked at a few additional parks, Point Reyes National Seashore in California and Joshua Tree National Park.
You've experienced kind of different flavors of the Park Service. It hasn't all been mountains or alpine, little desert.
Different flavors, yeah. I kind of split my passion between deserts and mountains, so it's been nice to work in both types of parks.
Right. And also a seashore.
And also a seashore, which was a really unique, new environment for me to learn and get to know. So yeah, it's been fun.
So you are a park naturalist.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned you're an interpretive ranger. Is being a park naturalist similar in ways, or is there some overlap, or maybe
so I think a lot of people use the terms interchangeably. Naturalist, I think, has a little bit more of a lengthy history, that term. But interpreters, we don't just talk about nature. Mm-hmm. We talk about human history and culture and society and how all of those things play together with the natural environment in our national parks, and kind of all those pieces are part of the story. So, interpreter, I think, is just a little more holistic term, a little more inclusive term to use for what we do in the parks. But I think naturalist resonates with a lot of people because that's a term they're familiar with. For a long time, that's been a term that we've used to describe the kind of work that park rangers do in national parks.
Right.
But interpreter is kind of what our profession is known as. So.
Okay. And of course, there are interpreters in areas that are perhaps less natural, the more historic sites.
Exactly. Yeah. There's people who just interpret cultural history, and certainly you can't separate the two completely in any instance, but there's definitely national parks that the story they tell is much more a cultural story. And so the interpreters there, definitely wouldn't call themselves naturalists because, they would call themselves historians probably before they would consider a term like naturalist.
Right. But here your role is very much as a naturalist as well as
for the most part. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I think a lot of the stories we tell here do have to do with the natural resources in the park, but also the culture.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if you've been here at Rocky Mountain National Park for a while. You've experienced a good bit of this very large unit.
Yeah.
And also have a unique insight into a unique area, which is the Alpine Tundra. So can you describe for the listeners, just in a general sense, what Rocky Mountain National Park is like?
I think Rocky Mountain National Park for a lot of people it's a mountain park. You've got these incredible, dramatic mountain peaks that have been sculpted by glaciers. So you've got this bare, rugged rock with long, lingering snow throughout the summer. You've got these dense, beautiful forests at lower elevations. You've got wide open, sunny, warm meadows. And that's just in the summertime. And then in the winter, you have this whole other world of a high mountain ecosystem that's, buried in snow for 8 months of the year. So it's very much a mountain park. I think the scenery here is what most people are first struck with, but then there's just a lot of nuance with the various environments because of the mountains and all the different elevations. And then the fact that you have the east side and west side of the mountains, and that affects the weather and the climate, and therefore it affects, how a forest might feel on one slope versus another. And so I think as you get to know a park like this, the scenery is still kind of what speaks to you most loudly, but then all these other nuances become the quieter voices that you get to know. And I think the Alpine Tundra in this park, the highest elevations are, for a lot of people, some of the most dramatic places to visit in the park.
Certainly. Yeah, you get these expansive views above the tree line.
You do.
Right.
It feels otherworldly, I think, in a lot of ways. It's uncomfortable, I think there's a comfort to being in the forest, having trees. They kind of anchor us into what's normal in our lives. And then, for a lot of people, I think when they get above that limit where trees can grow, it feels like a whole different planet almost. And then there's all these unexpected discoveries of, all the plants that grow up there and interesting animals, and the fact that you could leave Denver in your flip-flops and tank top and now you're freezing when you get out of your car at, higher elevation. So yeah, it's just a really unique part of the park. And I think it's one of the things that makes this park really special.
So you mentioned the Alpine Visitor Center, and we are not there right now. We're talking to
Not
you.
possible.
No, we're talking to you in early May. So why is that we're not in that Alpine Visitor Center?
I think one of the things that's really cool about Rocky Mountain National Park is this road that we have through the heart of the park, Trail Ridge Road. It's the highest through paved highway in the U.S. And because it's high and it stays high, it's not like a lot of mountain passes that just go up and kind of peak and then you go right back down again. You go up and you stay up high, meandering along these super high elevation rolling mountaintops.
And what sort of elevation are we talking about?
We're talking like 11,000 feet to 12,000 feet for 10 miles. And so that huge stretch of road that's at that elevation just makes it impossible to keep open year round. So the road closes, the visitor center gets buried in snow, and then we don't really start plowing and digging it out until mid to late April. And so it's not even possible for us to be at the Alpine Visitor Center right now. We haven't even reached the Alpine Visitor Center with plows yet to see how high the snow is on the eaves of the building. And that's still another week or so out before we get to that point. And that's it's
a yearly exploration.
It is, and it's a crazy, ridiculous place to have a visitor center in the grand scheme of things. But that's what makes it so awesome and so special, I think, is because it is just such a ridiculous place to have a building.
Right.
Sitting at almost 12,000 feet and buried in snow for 6-7 months of the year.
So yeah, efforts are underway right now to get up there.
They are.
But it's kind of been a drier year this year, and yet it's still buried. You haven't gotten up there yet.
Yeah, we're certainly anticipating less snow, but it'll still be an undertaking to dig the building out.
Yeah. How much snow does the visitor center up there get typically on an average?
So we don't actually measure the snow in that area. It's really hard in the Alpine here to measure snow because of the wind. The wind redistributes the snow so much. So we tend to have either areas that drift in 10, 20 feet deep, and then other areas where there's just a very thin, if any, snow for much of the winter because of the high winds. But, it's not unusual for the building to have 8-10 feet of snow up against the walls, exterior walls, and up onto the roof. In some years, it even goes up to the peak, which is 12-14 feet high.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of snow. Even in a dry year, it's a lot of snow.
Yeah, still significant. So what are some of the challenges involved in keeping a visitor center open even, 4 months out of the year? Yeah,
so late May through early October. Early in the season, the challenges, of course, are just getting the building accessible, literally digging out the doors of the building.
Yeah.
And then we don't have any utilities that aren't on site up there. So the electricity is generated on site with generators, and the water is from a well on site. We have a point-to-point microwave system for communications via phones. We don't have phone lines. You don't really get a cell signal there. So it's very much off the grid. So just the challenges that go into that side of things, just having a functionality of a building like that. We can't have water early in the season when we're open to the public because our system isn't capable of not freezing. With the low temperatures we still can tend to get it in late May and early June. And then the same thing in September, we have to winterize our running water system before we close to the public. So there's these periods of time where we're the busiest visitor center in the park, and yet, there's outhouses and that's it. And there's no running water, which I think is a little bit of a dichotomy for people. They're just not expecting that kind of busy visitor center, but very basic, primitive services. So that can be challenging too. And then it's challenging really for the visitors up there. A lot of times the high altitude, we get a lot of visitors who just physically, medically can't handle that altitude. And so we have an EMS facility attached to our visitor center where we can help people who get into trouble up there. But that's kind of an extra layer of challenge with that operation being such high elevation, is that we don't just have to help folks plan their visit and make safe choices about where to hike in the park. We also sometimes have to provide them with life-saving medical care, which is a whole other layer of complexity to an already really busy operation.
And with that thin air and some of those considerations, I imagine there's special training for everyone who's up there staffing the building as well.
So all of the rangers that work at the Alpine Visitor Center are not only, interpreters or naturalists, as you call them, but they're also EMTs. It's a requirement of the job, which is kind of a unique combination of skills. So it takes, a unique individual that wants to combine those two passions and skill levels to work there.
To educate, but also be able to aid.
Definitely, and have the mindset to handle, emergencies in an efficient and calm manner. Not everybody has that desire or talent. So.
We've been up there, but perhaps listeners haven't experienced this visitor center. It's a striking building. It's a large building. It looks very well established, even though it is kind of an off-grid, as you put it, facility. So what makes that whole area and that visitor center, the visitor center is built to kind of withstand the environment up there?
Definitely. So it was built in the 1960s, and the building adjacent to the visitor center was built in the 1930s. So there's been infrastructure at that location for a really long time, which is surprising in and of itself. But, the design of the building took into account the snow loading on the roof and the, 100 mile per hour plus winds that are not uncommon in the wintertime. Right. And then kind of the shoulder season, how does that snow melt and where does it go? And those things, I think, came into play when they designed the visitor center. And it's just a unique place to have a facility like that. It's the highest visitor center in any national park. So that alone makes it kind of special. And then the environment it's in is just really harsh for much of the year.
Right. So back to this alpine area and kind of the climate and how it is unique, both in terms of animal life, plant life. You were talking about both having kind of some unique characteristics.
Definitely, because it is such a challenging environment just when it comes to the climate and the weather and the conditions. A lot of the plants and animals, especially those that live there year-round, when it comes to the animals, have to be really well suited to deal with that environment. So when it comes to the plant life, I think a lot of people are really surprised at the variety. There's over 300 species of plants that make their home in the high elevations here in the Southern Rockies. And the variety of wildflowers that bloom in the summer is really striking. I think a lot of people expect a more barren environment when they're driving through, and then when they take the time to stop and get out, all of a sudden there's this miniature wildflower garden at their feet, and it's really surprising and almost magical in a way, this little miniature garden of plants that really thrives in that environment through all these unique adaptations of cheating the growing season by having huge tap roots that store energy, kind of like a pantry, or having hairs covering the plant tissues, much like we'd put on a jacket. These fuzzy little plants that are able to stay warm, and silvery hairs that reflect back the super intense UV radiation that you get at that elevation because you're, literally closer to the sun. So there's less atmosphere filtering the intense sunlight, to the fact that most of the plants up there are long living, year after year, the same plant is working up the energy to flower after 20 years and then put on a few more flowers the next year. And, some of the plants up there are 50, 100 years old. You can't, as a plant, do all of your steps in life in one season because the season's so short. So there's just so much, unique adaptations that the plants have up there. And then the animals, things like Pika and marmots, and in the summer, the elk up there grazing off those big, huge meadows full of flowers and grasses. It's really unique. And I think a lot of people, there's iconic pieces of it for them, like those hillsides full of flowers in the summer, or the Pika that are scurrying frantically around to gather food and store it for the winter, or the marmots, lazing out on a rock, catching the sun because they're going to be hibernating for 8 to 9 months. It's just a really unique place. And I think when people take the time to kind of pick up on some of those really special adaptations and the nuances of the environment up there, it really becomes a special landscape for them. Certainly is for me. It's my happy place.
Yeah, it's where you found yourself now for some time.
Yes, there's a reason I've been at this park for quite some time. I love the Alpine Tundra here. I love the complexity of the operation up there at the Alpine Visitor Center. It's just it's a great place.
So you mentioned the elk, and that's actually a common draw. It's one of the most common animals to be seen within Rocky. So elk actually come up to the tundra in the fall for the rut. So what is this? What's that all about?
So the elk actually come down from the tundra in the fall for the rut.
Right. Okay.
They come up to the tundra in the summer for the summertime for the forage. As things are drying out and browning up down low, it's still green up high. The season kind of is delayed as you go up in elevation. So it's spring right now down here. Near the Beaver Meadows Visitor Center, we have flowers popping out, but you go up 1,000 feet and there's still, 20 inches of snow on the ground. So because of that elevational change, the elk kind of follow the melting snow and the greening grass up the mountains, spend the summer in the high elevations. And then, as the days start to get shorter, it gets a little cooler, it kind of signals to them, hey, it's time to start moving back down to those big meadows at lower elevation for the rut, the mating season.
Okay.
And that is a huge draw at Rocky Mountain National Park. In terms of just watchable wildlife, this is a fantastic park. I think there's other parks that are known for that, and sometimes I don't think that's what people first think of when they think of Rocky Mountain National Park. But elk, deer, bighorn sheep, coyotes, birds, squirrels. We have a lot of really great wildlife viewing here in the park, and the elk are definitely like the superstars when it comes to wildlife, for sure.
Yeah, we saw a few elk on the drive up here to the Beaver Creek Visitor Center, and also some snow.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah,
and we're supposed to get some snow tonight.
Are we?
Potentially down at this elevation.
Okay. So what elevation are we at right now?
We're at about 7,800 feet here at the Visitor Center. And then it's all up from here pretty much.
All uphill to about 11 to 12,000 feet.
Yeah, so the road
Alpine
peaks
area.
at 12,183 feet in elevation. And then the Visitor Center sets at just shy of 12,000 feet.
Right. Definitely a unique experience to be able to come in the summertime and get up into those areas where things are in bloom. And once things have melted, it's almost difficult to imagine it being all under, you mentioned like 20 feet of snow at times.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. It's, I think the accessibility of our high mountain areas here is really great because a lot of people wouldn't be able to experience that kind of environment if it wasn't for Trail Ridge Road.
Trail Ridge Road has a bit of history as well.
It does. Yeah, it was built in the late 20s, early 30s, and it's a unique road in all of the United States.
Right. So we've captured some photographs of marmots and of pika. Pika are difficult.
They're always
photograph.
moving.
They are
always moving. Marmots tend to pose a little bit more for photos.
Yeah, lazing up on the rocks, as you
Exactly.
mentioned,
Yeah.
during the summer months. So what else can you tell us about those animals? Are they unique to the tundra area?
So in this part of the country, pika are definitely pretty unique to the tundra. You'll sometimes find them living in areas below tree line, but it has to be, just perfect, just right.
Mhm.
So they tend to be an alpine animal here just because of their requirements for cool temperatures. They're really good at storing heat with their metabolism and their size. They're the size of a softball, but they're not good at shedding heat. So they can't live in warm environments. They have to be able to escape warm days, even in the tundra here now, with warmer temperatures being more common. They have to have rock piles that they can kind of escape into, kind of like going in the basement to stay cool. And then they don't hibernate. A lot of people are really fascinated by that. This animal that spends its entire life in a really harsh environment where, snow starts to accumulate by October, doesn't completely melt until June, and they don't sleep. What do? So they have to gather food basically all summer long. So that's why they're really hard to photograph sometimes, because they're always moving. They're always running back and forth from their rock piles where they live out into a meadow to clip off some flowers and grasses, and then they lay them out to dry, and they build these huge hay piles, and then all winter long they just munch on their hay piles and survive the winter pretty well, as long as they're in an area where the snow accumulates. The snow actually provides a nice insulating layer over their burrows in the rock piles.
Okay.
So low snowfall years are a little dicey for pika because they don't have that insulative layer of snow. So if the temperatures get really cold, which they tend to do regardless of if we have a lot of snow or not, they can freeze to death in the wintertime, which is kind of interesting. It's not what you think of when you think of a changing climate affecting an animal,
Right.
but that's definitely a risk the pikas have here.
So they actually want the snow.
The snow is
They want
good.
to see more of it.
Snow in general is helpful to a lot of animals, just because it either insulates them if they live underground or at ground level. It can elevate them. For some animals, it's like an elevator. All of a sudden, it gets you into reach of food you may not have been able to nibble on before. If you can walk on the snow, like some of the smaller hares and rabbits.
Yeah.
And then, just that insulative quality of snow is so important.
Yeah.
And definitely important to the marmots too. Marmots are another animal people tend to think of as an alpine animal, but they're really more found at all elevations in the park. But they hibernate, so they need that warm, layer of snow to protect them when they're hibernating too. Although since they communally hibernate, they kind of have a slumber party where they're all keeping each other warm and tend to do okay if the snow is a little less.
So they snuggle up for body heat.
They do, and they sleep. I mean, they go to bed in September, and they do not wake up until May.
Oh, really?
And that is a long time out of every year to be hibernating. They spend more of their lives hibernating than they do awake, which is pretty remarkable.
And then when they're awake, they're easier to photograph because they're often up on rocks.
They tend to kind of have a lazier lifestyle because they have to build up a lot of body fat for hibernation to survive hibernation. So they tend to not exert excess energy unless it's absolutely needed. So they spend a lot of time eating and taking naps. So.
Yeah. Which they can be seen doing above tree line in particular, which
They
I guess is
can.
why people think of them as more alpine.
Yes. I mean, you'll find them all the way down into the foothills, but they definitely are thought of more as an alpine animal, kind of the high elevation cousin of the woodchuck.
So what is your favorite thing about Rocky Mountain National Park? You've been drawn back here.
For me, the Alpine Tundra is, it really is my happy place. It's where if I'm having a really bad day, I just need to close my eyes and picture one of those wildflower, covered slopes along Trail Ridge Road, and it kind of centers me again. I tend to really like wide open spaces, and I think that's one reason why I'm really drawn to the Alpine Tundra here in the park, and also to the desert. I mentioned early on, I kind of split my passion between the desert and the mountains. And for the mountains, it's always been those really wide open, high areas of the mountains that are kind of rugged, harsh, where you can tell like it's not a friendly place in a lot of ways. because of the environment, much like the desert. I think I like both of those environments for many of the same reasons. But the Alpine Tundra here is definitely what my favorite part of Rocky Mountain National Park is. The Alpine Tundra. It's just really unique, really special, and I think if you take the time to get to know it, it's just a landscape that'll just blow your mind.
Yeah. You mentioned that it's kind of a rugged area. It's kind of a sensitive area as well. So I imagine there's a good bit of preservation and education that goes into through a lot of visitorship, keeping those areas kind
It
of
is
natural.
a really sensitive environment, and I think sometimes people are surprised by that because you think about it being so harsh, so what lives there has to be tough, right? And that's definitely the case, but on the flip side, because especially in terms of the plants, because the growing season is so short, they tend to grow very slowly. So we can have huge impacts in a relatively short amount of time. So just a couple visitors walking off of a trail and grinding their feet while they're turning around, taking pictures, will wipe out maybe 10, 20 years of growth for some of the plants here. And then it takes them that long to catch back up. So there's a cumulative effect when you have a lot of visitors in one area going off of hardened surfaces. And now that the park gets 4.5 million visitors, that's a big concern. So indeed, any of the popular areas up there, visitors can do a huge service by just staying on the sidewalk, staying on the trails, staying in the parking areas. You may think it's just me walking over there to get this photograph, but if that was a draw for you, it's probably a draw for many people. So limiting that impact can make a huge difference for how resilient that plant community is long term. There's other challenges that the Alpine Tundra is facing with changes in precipitation and temperatures and climate shifts. So I think the more we can limit our impacts, knowing that so many people have access to that incredible landscape, the more resilient that landscape will be long term, so that my kids can come here in 40 years and bring their kids and have a similar amazing magical quality experience in a healthy environment. And I think that's where everyday visitors have the ability to impact down the road what this environment is going to be for the future.
Yeah. So just being aware of yourself as a steward.
Definitely. And taking that extra moment to say, okay, am I being selfish and wanting to get that perfect photograph? And what are the potential impacts of me doing that? And then just, we set examples for fellow humans every day in the actions we take and the choices we make. And so I think in a place like Rocky Mountain National Park, thinking about the actions that you have and how they influence others is important too. We're social creatures, and we tend to look at those around us and make decisions based on what other people are doing. So if we're making good decisions, then that has a wonderful domino effect, as does making bad decisions.
Right.
So.
Yeah, you will emulate what you see around you.
Exactly.
So when you think about Rocky Mountain National Park, which is a huge area, and you deal very much in the alpine areas, but as a whole, what does this park make you feel?
I mean, this park is home for me. It's a landscape that just feels like home. And it also makes me feel, connected to nature. It makes me feel connected to the future in a very tangible way now that I'm a parent, but also just connected to the future in terms of helping people be inspired by this place and connect what's happening here to what is happening at home for them, and the choices that they make, whether those be choices in terms of, how they consume and how they drive and how they live, and how those choices can impact this place. I think the role that I play in that story, helps me feel connected to a more hopeful future than I think we are exposed to a lot of times. There's so much doom and gloom out there. So I think a place like Rocky Mountain National Park helps you stay balanced in our world today, when there's so much you can get sucked into being awful and sad, and getting back out in the park and going for a hike, or, stopping along Trail Ridge Road to literally smell the flowers, really helps me stay grounded and hopeful and comforted that, this is still an amazing place. And there's still wonderful people in the world that value places like this and protecting them into the future.
Yeah. So it allows you kind of an opportunity to recenter of sorts.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think for me, going into nature does that in general. I try to escape for a couple backpacking trips every summer just to get away and kind of recenter myself and reinvigorate myself. But even just, looking out on this landscape can give me a little jolt of that when I need it, which is great.
Cool. So going a little larger picture from Rocky Mountain, what is the importance of the national park system as a whole, and why do you feel it's important to preserve it?
Yeah, that's actually a complicated question, because I think it's not just one thing. I think in general, even though I am personally really drawn to natural parks and nature and natural landscapes, I think the national park system as a whole, most importantly, preserves just this multifaceted, complex, sometimes ugly, oftentimes beautiful fabric of who we are as a country. Whether that's the fact that we have set aside these iconic, amazing natural landscapes, or that we've set aside places where we've done shameful things in the past, and things that we potentially, definitely should be learning from and not forgetting, battlefields and monuments and historic sites. I think, there's so much that the National Park Service preserves and protects, and so many stories, and, the diversity of stories. I think there's something for everyone in our national parks. And I think the fact that we preserve that, and we're constantly trying to tell the stories that maybe haven't been told, or tell a story from a new angle, to include more of the complexities of what it means to be, American, the history of this country, and then also where are we going? I think there's a lot the national parks can teach us and inspire us as we look forward to as a society.
This world is a complex place, and the effect we have on the world as humans is likewise complicated. On a journey to Rocky Mountain National Park, what can we learn about ourselves? Can we look to the animals like the elk and learn how to respect places like this? The elk were brought to near extinction in the Colorado area by human hand, but because we set aside Rocky Mountain National Park and transplanted a herd, they are here today. Places like the Alpine Tundra are fragile, and our awareness of ourselves in the parks is important to their preservation for the future. They say, take only pictures, leave only footprints. But perhaps adding awareness of our footfalls is important too. Next time you're outside in nature, take a moment to look around you. See and appreciate the complexity. The choices we make today can affect future generations, and we can all learn by studying our past and the environment around us today. If you enjoyed what you heard, review us on iTunes or your favorite podcast provider to help us improve the show. For more interview content with Ranger Cynthia about the night skies in Rocky and her life outside of being a park ranger, join our Patreon community. As little as $2 a month gets you access to bonus interview questions. A link is posted in our show notes, or visit podcastswithparkrangers.com. Stay with us through the final minutes for a short preview of our next episode. We like to highlight on our show ways that a typical park visitor can give back to their national parks. The Rocky Mountain Conservancy, established in 1931, is one of the oldest nonprofit cooperating organizations in the national park system. The group promotes stewardship with the park and provides educational publications, research support, and philanthropic aid for Rocky Mountain National Park and surrounding public lands. To learn more, visit rmconservancy.org. Even though we interview park rangers, we are not affiliated with the National Park Service, and any views expressed are not necessarily those of the Park Service. We're just fans of the national parks, like you. Coming up in episode 10 of Podcasts with Park Rangers, we take this show to new heights, over 14,000 feet to be exact, as we interview climbing ranger Kevin Sturmer to talk about Long's Peak, search and rescue, and what it's like to combine his passion with his career